Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. In this episode, I'm going to be giving my third and final installment in my series on Venus retrograde stories in the news that have been happening over the past several months. I did a whole episode on Venus retrograde in Aries and that repeating cycle every 8 years that I recorded back on January 10th, 2025, just earlier this year, about 6 months ago at this point. And I did that with my friend Nick Diggin Best. And in that episode, we went back and looked at a bunch of instances when Venus went retrograde in Aries, just like it did this year, and how every 8 years, going back over the past century, when Venus went retrograde in Aries, we noted important news events that happened, and we noted important repetitions that took place. So over the past 6 months, a bunch of interesting repetitions have come up again that have tied the current time period into periods in the past in 8 year increments. And ever since we recorded that episode on January 10th, I've done two other installments where I've noted important news stories that have come up, especially ones that represented repetitions of stories that we covered in the original episode. And now that Venus has finally departed from the sign it went retrograde in, which was Aries, earlier in June, the extended retrograde period is now officially complete. So I wanted to do one last installment to talk about some Venus retrograde repetitions that came up in the news since the last time I did one of these episodes about 2 months ago. So the first news episode, Venus retrograde and the repetitions in the news, was episode 477, and I released that on February 7th. And then the second one, the last one I did, was part two, and that was released on April 27th. It was episode 487 that was titled Venus Retrograde in the News, Part Two. So this is the third and final one. I'm recording this on Saturday, June 21st, 2025, I started at about 3:10 p.m. here in Denver, Colorado. So I want to share some additional stories that I found, but I also want to give some summary explanations of some different things that I learned from studying this Venus retrograde cycle over the course of the past 6 months, starting in December and January when Nick and I did that research. So I ended up learning a lot in the process, and I'm hoping to pass on some of that knowledge both in this episode with some of my conclusions, as well as in the other episode that I just released, where I interviewed some specific listeners of the podcast and heard their stories about how both the Venus retrograde and the Mars retrograde have worked out over the past several months. And I think we learned a lot in that, but we can also learn a lot from news stories and from studying historical repetitions as well. So that's the purpose of this episode. And this will act as the final sort of like completion of this series that I've done on what must be almost like 10 episodes at this point of different aspects of Venus retrograde in Aries over the past several months. All right, um, one of the things this is going to demonstrate is that it's important to study these repetitions both in the lives of individuals, but also in terms of historical events, because both can be incredibly important for understanding and getting to the core of what this cycle is actually about. And even though some of the stuff I've focused on with the news ones has sometimes been focused on like celebrities and has almost seemed a little tabloidy at times, I think those instances are just as important because it can give you real insight into how to use the technique of these Venus retrograde repetitions and how to apply them both to personal charts of individuals, like if you were doing a consultation, but also how you can apply them in some instances to predict world events. So let me show the Venus retrograde graphic really quickly, just to one last time show the cycle itself and the time period that we're looking at, as well as the repetition years. All right, so here is the Venus retrograde diagram that was made for me by Madeline Decotes of honeycomb.co, which makes beautiful almanacs and other things like that. So this is my extended Venus retrograde period, which for me includes it's not just the retrograde itself when Venus was actually moving backwards in the sky from our vantage point from March 1st until April 12th, which was the most intense point, but it also includes the broader span of time when Venus first entered one of the signs that would retrograde in, which was Pisces on January 2nd. And then finally, when Venus departed the sign that it went retrograde in, which was Aries, and when it moved into Taurus on June 5th, which officially closed and ended this extended Venus retrograde period that we've been paying attention to over the past 6 months. So during this 6 months, we've been paying attention to repetitions of things from the past because we know that this Venus retrograde cycle repeats every 8 years. And here's the other diagram that we showed in the original episode that shows going back more than a century, all of the times that Venus went retrograde in the sign of Aries, going all the way back to 1905. So, um, in terms of this, I'm going to read these out for the audio listeners. So Venus first went retrograde in Aries in 1905, and then 8 years later, it went retrograde in Aries again in 1913 because the cycle repeats every 8 years. So 1913, then 1921, 1929, 1937, 1945, 1953, 1961, 1969, 1977, 1985, 1993, 2001, 2009, 2017, and 2025. So these dates are incredibly important because once you memorize these dates, and once I had memorized these dates, I started seeing these dates coming up over and over again over the past few months in current events and in the events that were happening in people's lives in some of these previous years. And it was showing a connection between what happened in the past and what was happening in the present when Venus had similarly done the same thing, which has gone retrograde in the sign of Aries. All right, so let me jump into my first news stories. Um, And one of them from like pop culture that I was really fascinated by is that in the original Venus retrograde in Aries episode we recorded on January 10th, one of the things I noticed when we studied the 1977 Venus retrograde in Aries is I noticed that the movie Star Wars was first released to great acclaim and success towards the tail end of that Venus retrograde in Aries around May of 1977. And so I thought that was really interesting because that was such a huge turning point for cinema and for movies, and especially for that series, which became such a long running and impactful movie series with many sequels and spin offs over the course of the past several decades. So, what I found really interesting then during this Venus retrograde is I noticed that Star Wars started coming up a lot in April and May this year, all over the news. And one of the biggest instances that was tied in with the Venus retrograde that I noticed is that on the weekend of April 27th, they re-released the Star Wars movie, The Revenge of the Sith, and it was re-released in theaters. And this movie was originally released in May of 2005, which was not Venus retrograde in Aries, but nonetheless, the re-release of a movie during this same Venus retrograde from when Star Wars itself was originally released in 1977 ended up actually being much more important than you would think because the re-release opened to huge success where it opened with a box office of like $25 million domestically, and it ended up being the second biggest opening weekend for the re-release of a movie in history. So I thought that was a fascinating theme to have a major re-release of a movie happening and coinciding essentially with the later part of this Venus retrograde cycle and to have it be a huge success. And that was actually a theme that I saw coming up over and over again, which is these re-releases of something or a rehash of something or a return back to something from the past. But in this instance, it was actually something that was successful. And I thought it was also interesting because the re-release of this movie also helped to further cement this important turning point that seems like it's taking place with some of the Star Wars fans in terms of a reappraisal of the prequel trilogy, where they had gotten a lot of hate in like the early 2010s because it became kind of like trendy to hate on George Lucas's three movies that he released in the late 90s and early 2000s, which is episode one, two, and three. But then after Disney started releasing its own sequel trilogy, once Disney bought Star Wars from George Lucas and they started releasing new movies, a whole new trilogy in the mid 2010s, that trilogy did not go well, and it caused a lot of fans to start sort of rethinking some of the hate that was directed towards George Lucas's prequel trilogy, which now look better in many respects in comparison. So I thought this was interesting because it's part of a broader, almost like reappraisal of something that's taking place at this time, it seems like to me. So, part of the take home lesson from this one was I felt like sometimes revisiting the past can actually work out well. And going back to the past is not always necessarily a mistake or is doomed to failure or something under Venus retrogrades, but sometimes it can actually be quite fruitful. And I thought that was an important take home lesson for this. I also noticed some other repetitions with respect to Star Wars. So it wasn't just that movie re-release, which was really big, but also on April 18th, there was a major Star Wars like celebration or convention that took place in Tokyo, Japan, where over 100,000 people from 125 different countries gathered to celebrate their love for Star Wars, was apparently the theme. And at the celebration, the Lucasfilm producers or production company released the details of two upcoming movies, including one where Ryan Gosling was announced to be the star. So that was interesting. And then, as part of this, on April 26th, George Lucas, the creator of Star Wars, did an interview with Turner Classic Movies. And I thought this is really striking because he doesn't do a lot of interviews these days after he sold the company to Disney more than a decade ago. But what was interesting about this interview that I watched is that he talked about the origins of Star Wars. And one of the things that I learned from that interview is that he said that the president of Fox Studios at the time, back in 1977, really went to bat for him, both in saying that he wanted to do a movie with George Lucas and do Star Wars with him in the first place, but also in the later, one of the things he said is in the later part of the process of getting Star Wars together for release in the spring of 1977, when Venus was retrograde and it was getting ready to come out, is apparently the other studio heads really did not like the movie, and they were talking about like selling it to another company and just like shelving it or getting rid of it. But he said that the president of Fox really went to bat for him and pushed to have the movie released during this time, and that he was like the reason why it still came to fruition as opposed to getting sold or shelved or something like that, and then became wildly successful. So I thought that was interesting because it means that what was happening during the Venus retrograde itself in the spring of 1977 is that the movie was still in the process of being finished and it was still in jeopardy. But then once Venus had stationed direct and it was moving through Aries after the retrograde, but still in the extended retrograde period, the movie was released, I think in May, to great success finally. So there's something about that because I've seen a few instances of that where there's another one that we'll talk about here in just a little bit with Nintendo, where sometimes something's being finished during the early phases of the retrograde, but it still has to go through a process of retooling, or sometimes there's like a crisis, or sometimes something that puts the whole project in jeopardy, or something that necessitates a redesign. But then after pushing through and persevering and doing any necessary revisions, Then by the time Venus stations direct and starts moving forward again, as it goes through the tail end of the retrograde sign post retrograde, things can be released and finished to great success still at that point in time. But that seems like an important sort of like archetype that I'm seeing over very recently of like a troubled rollout of something that has delays and goes through a retooling phase. But then once it's direct, things get worked out and smoothed out, and there's a successful launch or release. So those are two of the interesting things I found about, or three of the interesting things I found about Star Wars that tie into and caused it to be a major repetition right now in 2025 that connected events this year with events back to the original release of Star Wars in 1977. And the thing connecting them in time was this Venus retrograde in Aries. All right. So that was one. Another major one that I talked about extensively is the Oscars and Conan O'Brien, because in the original episode on June 10th, um, we talked a lot because Nick had already identified how this particular Venus retrograde in Aries was always super important for the Oscars, and it was always a very important turning point. And I actually did an entire episode documenting some of the things that happened at the Oscars and how this particular one also ended up being very important as well. And there were a lot of firsts. So I documented that in episode 481 titled Oscars Astrology Recap 2025. But there were some additional things that I noticed recently that are important. One of them is that there was a story that came out on April 21st this year that the Academy is now implementing a new rule that members must now watch all nominated films in each category to be eligible to vote in the final round for the Oscars. So this is a major change in terms of the way that the Oscars are done then, because evidently up to this point, there's been issues with people not necessarily watching all of the films that they were voting on, and therefore the voting getting skewed as a result of that for in different ways. So this is actually a pretty major like structural change if it works out and if it's enforced properly and everything else in terms of how the awards are actually given out eventually and which films end up winning if everybody voting on them actually has to watch them. So I thought that was a pretty striking, again, additional important turning point about how this Oscars, because it was Venus retrograde in Aries, ended up being more important again than usual because it ties all the way back into the history to the very first Oscars with the Venus retrograde in Aries. All right, another interesting repetition I noticed that I hadn't noticed at the time, but I just learned about recently was this year, one of the things that was noted is that Adrian Brody gave, I believe it became like the longest acceptance speech in history when he won for Best Actor. And one of the things he did is that he was already talking for like 2 minutes or something like that, and they started to play him off, but then he very sort of like forcefully told them to stop and said, you know, this isn't my first rodeo and I'm going to keep talking, so don't keep playing. And it was kind of surprising because that worked. And then the orchestra like stopped playing and then he talked for like this extended period of time that ended up giving him the longest speech in history. So, something I did not know or I hadn't really remembered was that in 2001, when Venus was retrograde in Aries, Julia Roberts won for Best Actress for her role in the movie Erin Brockovich. And she gave this famous speech where she actually told the orchestra conductor to sit down. And she kind of preempted it. But one of the things about it is she was much like more gentle and more charming about it so that it was kind of like a lighthearted, funny moment and like touching moment where she said, quote, "And sir, you're doing a great job, but you're so quick with that stick." She was talking about like the orchestra conductor's stick. So she said, "So why don't you sit because I may never be here again?" And then she went on to give this very gracious and great speech. And it's sort of remembered as this iconic moment in Oscar history due to her charm and authenticity and sort of playful defiance of the strict time limits that are put on, winners giving speeches. So, but she basically told like the orchestra conductor to sit down. And so that was another repetition of events then under the same Venus retrograde where you had, one of the winners for best actor and actress, interrupting or telling the orchestra person to like not interrupt and then sort of asserting themselves in that way in order to give their speech. So it went better for Julia Roberts and like not as well for it wasn't received as well for Adrian Brody this year, but it was nonetheless an interesting repetition. Um, so another set of things that happened was with Conan, where in the original episode on January 10th, I had noted it stood out to me that during the Venus retrograde in 1993, Conan was announced to be the new host of Late Night, and he was a relatively obscure like comedy writer up to that point, and then all of a sudden he became like a household name. And um, I didn't know in January 10th that he was going to be hosting the Oscars, so it ended up being an interesting confluence where we knew that this Venus retrograde was going to be important for Conan and it was also going to be important for the Oscars. But it was interesting because both of those coincided and he ended up hosting the Oscars and it ended up being received very well. Like he did extremely well, so much so that he's already been invited back to host again next year. So one of the things I noticed about Conan is he he did that, and he also had huge other. This was this huge moment for him this year because he was also awarded the Mark Twain Award for comedy, which I think I talked about in the last update. But one new thing that I noticed that I wrote down is that he did an interview with the Today Show in like I think it was May. It was either April or May of 2025. And one of the things that's striking when I watched this clip is that they said that it's almost exactly 32 years ago to the day that he did his first interview with the Today Show. And then they showed the clip, and it was from him, way back then in 1993 when he was just picked to host Late Night, and he became this like overnight, this sort of like household name virtually overnight after being plucked out of obscurity. And so it was striking because it was something simple. It was just a little singular television interview, but to see him do that interview almost exactly to the day with the same show, one at the very start of his career where there was still a lot of uncertainty, and then the second exactly 32 years later when he had reached, I want to say like the pinnacle of his career this year, was extremely interesting as a repetition. And then one last repetition, and Nick actually found this. Nick Diggin found this clip where Robin Williams was on Conan's show in March of 2009, which was during a Venus retrograde in Aries. Venus had just stationed retrograde in Aries in March of 2009, and they actually discussed the Oscars. And in this clip at one point, Robin Williams said to Conan, he said, "You should host it." And then Conan replies, "Yes, I'd like to someday," or something to that effect. And what's crazy about that is that that exchange happened when Venus had just stationed retrograde in Aries, and then exactly 2 8-year Venus cycles later, at the beginning of March of 2025, when Venus had just stationed retrograde in Aries, Conan actually did host the Oscars at that point. So that's an incredible, incredible repetition. And it's so minor in the sense of like, it's just, two people that were talking, Robin Williams and Conan O'Brien talking and having that exchange together that was very quick, but it still actually foreshadowed something that would actually come to fruition once the same planetary alignment recurred exactly, almost exactly to the day 16 years later. So there's something extraordinary about that that I was just blown away by, and I wanted to to point that out and yeah, give a shout out to Nick for noting that one. So um, I think the take-home lesson here is that sometimes when you identify that a particular Venus retrograde series has been important in separate stories, like for example with the Oscars and with Conan, that sometimes you should pay attention to the possibility of crossovers when that same Venus retrograde recurs again. And it almost like heightens the possibility of an important crossover at some point in time in the future if you've noticed that that same retrograde is important to two separate things that could have a crossover at some point in the future. Um, so if a particular retrograde has been shown to be important for two people or events in the past, then the recurrence of that transit could bring those two things together or make them cross paths again in a notable way that represents like a defining turning point for both of them, which I think was true for both Coden and the Oscars in this instance. So that's part of my take-home lesson from studying those two. All right, moving on to my next story. Another major story in like nerd news was Nintendo. And one of the major ones that I noticed in the episode that we recorded on January 10th is when Nick and I went back and did this huge research project of all of the past 8-year repetitions of Venus retrograde in Aries. One of the ones that I noticed as being like a former, like kid that was really into like Nintendo and stuff was that the original Nintendo Entertainment System, the NES, was released in 1985, and that was a Venus retrograde in Aries year. And one of the things I don't think I know, I didn't know this. I checked the transcript, but in the transcript, I didn't mention that Nintendo was actually about to release a new console this year, which is the Nintendo Switch 2 in 2025, and that this console was being released as a follow-up to their last extremely successful console, which is called the Nintendo Switch, that of course was released 8 years ago in 2017. So what ended up happening with this is the Nintendo announced the specs for the Nintendo Switch 2 this year, but there was a rocky and delayed rollout because right around the same time that Nintendo finally like unveiled what the console was going to look like and what its actual specifications were, Trump announced the tariffs like right around the same time. And because Nintendo is a Japanese company, it really threw everything into jeopardy in terms of whether they would be able to release it, whether it would be too costly, whether they would lose a bunch of money on it, and things like that. So they actually ended up delaying the release as a result of that. But then eventually, finally, the Nintendo Switch 2 was released on June 5th during the very, very late stages of Venus passing through the later part of Aries post retrograde, but still in that extended range of being in the sign that it originally went retrograde in. So what's really cool is that on June 10th, I caught a news story saying that the Nintendo Switch 2 has sold over had sold over 3.5 million units worldwide in just its first 4 days, which made it the fastest selling Nintendo hardware ever globally. So apparently it sold like extremely well and was a big success as being this like not just a launch of a new console, but the launch of a follow-up console to one that was released 2 years ago. So that in and of itself is just kind of interesting because it reminded me like one of the criticisms of the Nintendo Switch 2 in reading reviews is that Nintendo's kind of playing it safe. And although it's improved the specs of the console compared to the one it released 8 years ago, it's basically kind of doing the same thing as the original Switch that it released in 2017. There's not a lot of new innovations in really major ways aside from just improving the technical specs of like the memory and how fast it runs and things like that. So I thought this was interesting because it reminds me of another story that we saw play out during this Venus retrograde, which was the Lady Gaga release of this new album and this phrase that became popular on social media that I talked about previously about Lady Gaga reheating her nachos. And this became a phrase that even she commented on at one point in an interview, like I talked about, I think in the part two episode, news episode, where on the one hand, it's like a criticism because it's a potential criticism because it's like a statement that instead of coming up with something completely new and innovative, you're like returning back to the past and you are reviving something that you did in the past that went well as a way of both reliving that, but also playing it safe a little bit. But that ultimately, sometimes that can be okay and it can be a worthwhile strategy because there can be things that you did in the past that are really good that you can bring forward and update to some extent, but still by revisiting the past and bringing those things forward into the future, there's still some element of retreading familiar ground. But sometimes it's like the analogy with the nachos thing was like, sometimes you can heat something up and there's some foods that are not exactly as good as they were the first time you ate them, but still pretty good like the second time you eat them once you've heated up your leftovers. And this was one of those scenarios where both Lady Gaga as well as Nintendo were able to capture that element of the Venus retrograde energy, which is doing something you've already done, bringing it back from the past and updating it to some extent for the present times, and then being able to experience a similar level of success as a result of revisiting the past, essentially, as part of the theme there. So along those lines, even in terms of the games with Nintendo, one of their biggest selling games from the console that was released 8 years ago is that the Zelda game Breath of the Wild was released on March 3rd, 2017 as a launch title for the original Nintendo Switch when Venus was retrograde in Aries. And then what's interesting is 8 years later, one of the launch titles for the Nintendo Switch 2 that just came out is they released an updated version of the same game, basically, of Breath of the Wild with better graphics and quicker load times, but it essentially involved re-releasing the same game on a new system. So I thought that was, again, another element of going back to the past, reviving something from the past, updating it a little bit, like improving it, taking the opportunity when you're going back to the past and bringing something forward to like update and tweak it a little bit, even if functionally it's still the same thing, but how that can still be successful. So that in and of itself was like an amazing story for me that I've been watching unfold in just like the news over the past several months. But then because Nintendo's been all over the news due to that, and I started getting like recommended YouTube videos on it that I would watch occasionally, like on the history of Nintendo. I learned about some other repetitions that I didn't know about in Nintendo's history as well. So one of the things I didn't know is that the Nintendo Entertainment System that was released in 1985 was actually not their first console, but there was actually an earlier console that was released in Japan. And guess when it was released? It was released 8 years earlier in 1977 when Venus was retrograde in Aries. So this console was called the Color TV Game. It was only released in Japan in 1977, and it was essentially kind of like a Pong clone, like a clone of the game Pong. But it was released on June 1st, 1977, when Venus was still in late Aries, like it was when they just released the Switch 2 here on June 5th. So post retrograde, but Venus direct, moving forward, but still in the retrograde sign. So at the very tail end of the extended retrograde period. So this console apparently was successful enough that it caused Nintendo to start focusing on this area more so that 8 years later, eventually they would release the Nintendo Entertainment System, not only in Japan, but also in the United States and abroad, which then one of the things that was interesting about that is that there had been a crash in the video game industry in 1983 due to like an oversaturation of the market and like low quality games and things like that. So one of the things that was important when Nintendo released its system in 1985 is it helped spur the revival of the video game industry in general at that point, which many observers had thought, might be dead because of this major crash that had just happened a couple of years earlier. So, yeah, first console was in 1977. And then, interestingly, another piece of trivia that I noticed that I did not know that I learned about recently is the video game designer, legendary video game designer at Nintendo, Shigeru Miyamoto, was actually hired by Nintendo in the year 1977, originally as an artist. Apparently, his father helped him get the job after impressing the president with his toys. And then he started helping design some of the artwork. But then eventually, he ended up designing the games Donkey Kong. And then eventually, he ended up designing the first Mario Brothers game at the 1985 repetition, which ended up becoming the main game that was released with the Nintendo Entertainment System, which really established Nintendo and became their most popular and sort of like enduring property. So my point is that, and he became undoubtedly like the most important and influential video game designer at Nintendo ever, and perhaps even in terms of like the history of video games in general, he's like one of the most iconic characters. And so the point is that he was hired in 1977, but then eventually he designed and released Super Mario Brothers for the Nintendo in 1985, which became huge and set up everything else. Um, Interestingly and weirdly, this like story, this Venus retrograde comes up all over their history and other places. Like, so Super Mario Brothers was released in 1985, and get this, they made a Super Mario Brothers movie, which was not very well received in the 1990s. Guess when it came out? It came out in May 28th, 1993. So it came out during the Venus retrograde in Aries in 1993, exactly 8 years after the original Nintendo was released with the original Super Mario Brothers game. So that was crazy. There's a bunch of other, if you read through the Wikipedia entry for Nintendo, you'll notice a bunch of other instances in their history where this particular Venus retrograde in Aries comes up. But I'm gonna not go through all of those right now because some of them are interesting but are more minor. But I noticed one that was just like staggeringly impressive that I was not expecting that blew me away, which is that I was watching this like history video and it said that Nintendo was founded in the year 1889, originally as a playing card company for like cards. And like that year sounded familiar. And then I looked it up, and that was the same exact Venus retrograde cycle that keeps repeating every 8 years, like the one we're in now, like 2025 when the Switch 2 was released, 2017 when the Switch was released, 1985 when the original Nintendo was released. It turns out that the company itself was founded the same year as this same retrograde period that repeats every 8 years. So what's interesting about this, though, is that um, Venus, um, every 8 years, Venus goes retrograde in roughly the same spot in the zodiac, but it moves backwards by 2 degrees. So as a result of that, over the course of a century, the retrogrades will shift through the signs. And what's interesting is that this retrograde back in 1889, it was connected to the Venus retrograde in Aries series, which started in 1905 when Venus first retrograded back to station direct in the later degrees of Aries. But in 1889, this retrograde was still entirely in Taurus. But then in 1889, so it has that retrograde in Taurus. Nintendo is founded, and then 8 years after that would be what, like 1897, and then 8 years after that would be 1905, and that's when our Venus retrograde in Aries chronology really picks up. But for the first half of the 20th century, this retrograde would start in Taurus and then it would end and station direct in Aries. So, my point here and what's important about this example is it demonstrates something Nick had said that turns out to be very true, which is that these Venus retrogrades track across the signs if you go and look at them extending over more than a century. That while my conclusion is that while the sign that it goes retrograde in is still important and can be informative in terms of the repetitions, once something gets started under a specific retrograde cycle, because of the 8 year repetition of Venus, that we know Venus will go retrograde in the same spot every 8 years, it ties together events in time in those 8 year increments, going back to the very start, going back to the foundation of that thing, even if the retrograde itself didn't start in that specific sign of the zodiac. So, in a way, the technique, to some extent, is actually independent of what sign of the zodiac the retrograde is in and can be tracked back over centuries, going back as part of the same cycle. So, this is interesting to me because that's a really striking example of it. This is something that Nick Dagan Best has already done like tons of work on and has established. And he actually developed an entire system that I think we talked about at the very tail end of the original Venus retrograde in Aries um, episode that we recorded on January 10th, where he's developed a system for like naming and categorizing these retrogrades that's independent of the zodiac. And I think that's important. And although I've been using a shorthand and just saying that this is the Venus retrograde cycle in Aries because that's the easiest way to convey it to people and to say what we're talking about. Even that's not super precise because, like, for example, the last couple of times, the last three times of this Venus retrograde cycle, it hasn't just been in Aries, but it's also it started in Aries and Venus is retrograded back into Pisces. So that was true of 2025, of 2017, and 2009, that it's been a Venus Pisces retrograde rather than just a Venus in Aries retrograde. But for the sake of like simplicity, I've just been calling it the Venus retrograde in Aries because for the most part, it's touched that sign over the course of the past century from 1905 to 2025 in some way, in one way or another. But the takeaway is just that for very long term things, you can track this back more than a century, and sometimes it will still show repetitions just based on that repeating 8 year pattern. And that's just absolutely incredible and like stunning to me. So I wanted to share that example with everyone because I was really, really blown away. So, takeaways, the other takeaways with this is just that obviously that means the technique can be applied to companies as well. It's not just people, you can also apply it to companies. You may be able to use it to anticipate the success or failure of certain product launches. So the fact that like Nintendo released the Switch in 2017 and it was very successful means that the repetition of this also indicated a very successful period for Nintendo. I guess it still remains to be seen how it goes for them overall in terms of this console cycle, but we'll see. Um, and then, yeah, the connection shows that the connection with the founding of something, if it's born with the Venus retrograde in a specific sign, then we know that the repetition of that will always be important every 8 years. And now we've seen that here with Nintendo, we've seen that with Star Wars. We've seen it with the Oscars, we've seen it with Conan, and so on and so forth. So it's a really solid principle at this point. All right, so another notable news story that I saw in the news recently is more minor, but I just thought it was a very interesting repetition. So there was news over the past few months that Trump was going to redesign the Rose Garden at the White House and was going to get rid of the grass and was going to put down concrete there. And construction has begun on that after making his announcements. He's also installing two flagpoles on the north and south lawns. So I was reading about this in the news recently because there was news about them breaking ground and working on this construction already on the Rose Garden. And in the newspaper article, it said that the first rose garden was installed in 1913 by First Lady Ellen Wilson, who was the first wife of President Woodrow Wilson. So 1913 was a Venus retrograde in Aries. So that means that the rose garden, originally installed in 1913, is now having a repetition of the same Venus retrograde, and it's getting a major redesign and a major makeover. One other notable time that that's happened when there was a major redesign and expansion of the Rose Garden happened in 1961, where in that year, in the first half of that year, was when President John F. Kennedy was elected and came into office with his wife, Jacqueline Kennedy. And what happened is that in May of 1961, they made their first state visit to France and England and Austria. And while they were on this trip, they noted that the White House didn't have any sort of comparable garden or attractiveness compared to the ones that they were seeing in Europe while they were on this trip. So this trip happened. It started, the trip to France began on May 31st, 1961, when Venus was just at the very tail end of Aries coming off of the retrograde. So during that Venus retrograde trip, they were inspired seeing all these gardens in Europe. And then they came back and they started working on and they hired somebody to redesign the Rose Garden, basically, where they expanded it significantly. So now Trump is paving over the grass and putting concrete down and also doing some sort of other unspecified audio and visual upgrades. And it's supposed to be finished in August, but it was initiated during this time of the Venus retrograde. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes and what happens and how it's received. All right. Another major one in the news that's just happened and that's unfolding, of course, was the war that's currently taking place between Iran and Israel, and probably soon the United States. So today's June 21st, 2025. This situation's been ongoing over the past week or so, and it will probably escalate, I'm guessing, based on the upcoming ingress of Uranus into the sign of Gemini. Yeah, so quick update that I have to add in post is that later the same day that I recorded this episode, Trump bombed Iran and the open war between the US and Iran began. So I recorded this episode earlier in the afternoon on June 21st, 2025. And then I finished it, and like maybe an hour or two after I finished, the news broke that he had bombed the nuclear facilities in Iran. So yeah, I just wanted to point that out for those that were curious. I'm editing this episode later the same night, so I'll put this update in, I'll splice it into the middle of the video. And here's a diagram that shows the Uranus transit that I was referring to, which is the Uranus and Gemini periods, because the United States was born with Uranus and Gemini back in the 1700s, and Uranus was in Gemini during the course of the Revolutionary War. But then Uranus comes back to the same spot every 84 years, and every time it does that, the US is involved in a major war. So the first time it came back to where it was when the country was founded was the Civil War in the middle of the 1800s. Then the next time was World War II between 1941 and 1949, and specifically the US's involvement in World War II, which began in 1941, even though the war had already been going on for a bit prior to that point. And then finally, the next time is Uranus is going into Gemini again in 2025, about 2 weeks from now on July 7th. So this is a little early, but it's because it's because Uranus has been getting set off by a square from Mars over the course of the past week or so that really coincided with Israel launching its initial strike against Iran a week ago, and now everything is sort of snowballing from there. So if you want to hear more about this concept of the Uranus return of the United States, I actually did a whole episode on it way back in 2022 with my friend Nick Dagan Best, and you can find that on the podcast website by just searching the Uranus return of the United States. And you can learn more about that episode. And then, of course, I've talked about it in some of the recent forecast episodes, like the year ahead forecast. And we'll probably talk about it again, especially in the next month ahead forecast episode for July of 2025 that we're going to record next week. So I think that's enough for this update. I just wanted to let people know the timeline of when I recorded this episode. All right, so let's resume from here. But one of the things that I noticed is I was reading a news article the other day and they were repeating just common things that are known about, but it mentioned the year and it reminded me of something I had forgotten about, which is that the US helped to overthrow the government of Iran in 1953 and install the Shah. And what's crazy about that is 1953 was both a Venus retrograde in Aries year, and it was also a Saturn Neptune conjunction. So that's part of the recurrence that we're having right now is a Saturn Neptune conjunction and a Venus retrograde in Aries. And what is crazy about that is I've been seeing a like interviews with like the son of the Shah who was installed in 1953 and that eventually he was overthrown in the Iranian Revolution, especially in 1979. But now all of a sudden like the son of this Shah from 1953 has like resurfaced in like interviews over the past few weeks, and it seems like there's like an angle people are angling for him to like return possibly. We'll see how that goes, but there's some kind of weird repetition that's happening right now that we can see have an access point to astrologically between 1953 and 2025, and it's partially due to this connection between Venus retrograde in Aries and Saturn Neptune conjunction happening in the sky at the same time. So one interesting piece of that is it's more connected to the Saturn Neptune, but it's interesting that it was playing out in 1953. Is I was reading this Washington Post article, and it said the title was "The U.S. helped oust Iran's government in 1953. Here's what happened." And at one point, about halfway through the article, there's a paragraph, and it says, "Quote." On August 19th, rebels overran the broadcast studio of Radio Tehran and prematurely declared that on the radio that Mossadegh's government had collapsed that afternoon, that the existing government had collapsed. However, in fact, that had not yet happened. And then it quotes a historian who says, quote, after that radio broadcast, it was over. This was one of the most effective pieces of fake news in recent history of the world, this historian Ranjabar Dami said. So I thought that was incredible because that really brings in the Saturn Neptune component where basically it's like the US and Britain came in and organized a coup. And part of what they did that ended up being like an important turning point that summer in 1953 was they took over the primary radio broadcast system, and they claimed that the existing government had fallen when it hadn't. And then people believed them, and as a result of that, that actually snowballed and led to the government actually being overthrown. So there's some interesting, crazy repetitions happening of that right now with both of those cycles repeating. Um, so one other really important piece of this is that I noticed that this Venus retrograde, I haven't researched this extensively. I'm actually trying to research this more right now in preparation for our next forecast episode that we're going to record at the end of this month, and I'll have more to say about it then. Here, I'm mainly just restricting myself to making a few points about the Venus retrogrades because I noticed the Venus retrograde year is coming up here, and this is a obviously very important, like crucial event that's happening right now. But one of the things I noticed is that 1977 was also a Venus retrograde year, and I was reading some things about how while the Iranian Revolution culminated in 1979, the year 1977 was actually a critical turning point when widespread open opposition to the Shah began to boil over, which sort of set the stage for the eventual overthrow of the government, which was completed in 1979. So I think that's interesting because it means it ties back then through that Venus retrograde period from 1977 that that was a repetition of, and it was tying back into the original overthrow of the government in 1953 that installed the Shah in the first place. Other interesting ones I noticed just doing some quick research is that in 1985, apparently the Iran-Contra affair began, where the Reagan administration secretly facilitated the sale of arms to Iran, which was a major political scandal that eventually blew up. And apparently the sales were originally facilitated by Israel, with the US providing arms in exchange for Iran's help in securing the release of American hostages. Um, and then the profits from the arms sales were diverted to support the Contras in Nicaragua, despite a congressional ban on such aid. And it turned into this whole debacle. But it's kind of crazy that the Iran-Contra scandal was tied in with this Venus retrograde in 1985. 8 years later, in 1993, the Clinton administration began to intensify sanctions against Iran. 2009, which is another repetition, was when the Green Movement protests erupted in Iran following a disputed presidential election. And this was this really significant internal challenge to the Iranian government at the time and became a major international news story. 8 years after that, the next time Venus went retrograde, the Trump administration began the process of withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal, which is a major turning point in relations that basically set up everything that's happening today, where this war that's been initiated with Iran is being initiated under the premise of them not getting nuclear weapons, and that deal that Trump pulled the US out of the part of that process basically started in 2017. Um, so clearly that's important in terms of some of the repetitions that are happening with Venus. There's some separate side repetitions though that are happening with Mars that connect different years. For example, even though the Iranian Revolution was completed in 1979, it really began in 1978 in connection with this Mars retrograde in Cancer and Leo that was taking place that year. So there was this weird repetition where in 1978, Mars went retrograde in Cancer and Leo. Jupiter was in Gemini, and there were eclipses happening in Aries. So I mentioned this earlier this year. I think it was on the April forecast, because when I noticed those repetitions, among other things, we had been predicting for a while, in addition to this eclipse series, that we thought that there was going to be a war with Iran this year, and that did end up manifesting in a really dramatic way. But I wanted to mention that because while the Venus retrograde repetitions are clearly important in terms of some of what's going on, especially in terms of like it seems like the theme of like outside influence, like influencing or overthrowing things. There's also this other component with some of the other cycles that are happening right now as well, like the Mars retrogrades and Jupiter and eclipses in Aries and so on and so forth. So I'll talk about all of that more and give a more careful and sort of nuanced discussion later this month in the forecast episode once I've collected my thoughts more. But I wanted to mention this now, at least, since it is an ongoing thing. And I mean, it was actually one of we were I was uncharacteristically strong in my belief that war would begin this year because of some of the repetitions we were seeing, especially in the buildup with the eclipses. But then the more I started realizing there were other repetitions happening on top of that, the more sort of sure I became over the past 8 months that something very significant was going to take place. And the Venus retrograde was part of that, as well as some of those other repetitions, especially the eclipses, but also the Mars retrograde as well. So hopefully I'll do a more detailed treatment of that soon, but it's still an ongoing situation. So we'll see what happens. All right, so now I just have a series of miscellaneous smaller news stories that I saw come up in the news that were connected with the Venus retrograde that I wanted to mention. Some of them are obviously connected and are not necessarily repetitions, but just symbolically interesting ones that I thought were worth taking note of in order to learn something about what Venus retrogrades are all about. So, one of the more striking ones was on May 14th, Warner Brothers Discovery announced that it's renaming its streaming platform back to HBO Max this summer, which is reverting a change that it made 2 years ago, where they attempted to rebrand their streaming channel to just be titled Max. So this decision reportedly is being made to emphasize the company's premium content and its association with the HBO brand, especially according to this article I was reading from CNN. So this was a interesting one because it was really obvious like a couple of years ago that this was a massively bad idea to remove the name HBO from their streaming service and to just try to call it Max because there was already like decades of built up consumer sort of like goodwill towards HBO as being associated with a lot of really important, really successful like television shows and series like Game of Thrones or like The Sopranos or The Wire or other shows like that. And their attempt to just rebrand it as Max seemed really like a dumb idea and seemed really misguided at the time. And now, after 2 years, during the Venus retrograde itself, they actually made the decision to go back on that and to revert back to their previous name and to bring the name HBO back into the title. So that's again, it's important because it's just like re-emphasizing something where something about Venus retrograde occasionally forces people to go back to the past to revise and revisit previous decisions. But sometimes I think it's become tricky because sometimes I think in pop astrology, there's become a thing that, like if your ex comes back to you, that you should stay away from them or something during Venus retrograde, or that if you go back to the past, somehow it will always turn out poorly during Venus retrogrades. And while that's sometimes true, especially if we're talking about like interpersonal relationships and like relationships from the past, it's really not always true. It's really can break down and it can go either way because sometimes going back to the past can be important and it can actually be quite productive and useful because in some instances you may have made a mistake and the Venus retrograde actually presents an opportunity to go back and revise and fix something from the past and to make it better going forward once you've acknowledged that you've made some sort of mistake at some point leading up to this. And I think that's a really important lesson here. And it's a really well encapsulated by this example with just this streaming service and the way that it had to go back on something that was a mistake that it made from a couple of years ago. All right. Other news that I saw, the latest Mission Impossible movie came out in May, which I'm guessing is the last one based on the title. I haven't seen it yet. And I watched this interview with Tom Cruise at one point when he was doing like the press tour for it. And he actually said in this interview that he first went to the production studio Paramount in order to pitch the idea for doing a whole series based on the Mission Impossible movies in 1993. And that was, of course, both a Venus retrograde in Aries year, and it was also a Mars retrograde in Cancer year. So it was the 32 year repetition of both of those. So that would end up becoming the first movie that he would produce. And I thought it was interesting on the one hand that that retrograde then will essentially end up marking both the beginning of his process of doing these movies, of like making the first pitch for this movie series, but then also of him wrapping it up and bringing that to completion with the final movie in that same series being released under this Venus retrograde in Aries. So, who knows if like in 8 years he'll revisit it or what have you. He's getting older now, so maybe not. I don't really know. But the point is, to whatever extent there is some sort of sense of finality about this, it's pretty interesting that it coincided with the same Venus retrograde in Aries. And I haven't researched it beyond that. I just wrote down that headline once I noticed it after watching that interview. But now that I think about it, actually, there's probably a second point there, which is embedded in him going to Paramount to pitch this movie, is that the first movie was based on an existing property, which was this old television show called Mission Impossible. So that in and of itself even is actually a very Venus retrograde thing, is that when he made the original pitch in early in 1993 during the Venus retrograde in Aries, it was basically to revive like an old property and make it into a modern action movie with him as the star. So that's part of the reason why even the birth of it in the first place was a Venus retrograde thing. And I bet if you researched that, there would probably be some earlier things tied into the Mission Impossible series that would be tied in with that Venus retrograde as well. So that's something I'm learning, is when you see something like that and you see a repetition, sometimes you need to go out of your way then to study, to take it back further, because you can kind of intuit that there were probably earlier instances where that same Venus retrograde and that same 8 year cycle were relevant going back further. And that's for the most part, although I mean, the universe has kind of been like throwing some of these stories at me left and right, where once I memorized all of the Venus retrograde years for Aries, now, over the past 6 months, anytime I'm like reading a news article and it mentions one of those years, it really pops out to me and I take note of it. So, in one hand, some of the research I've been doing with these news stories has been the universe just like throwing these at me, but some of the other ones have been sometimes once you notice a repetition between 2 years, you know that if you just like sit down, like I did with Nintendo, and just like read the Wikipedia page, you'll see the same repetitions coming up, going back even further than you expect. Sometimes like much further than you would expect, like with Nintendo going back all the way to 1889, which is just crazy. So somebody should research that and let me know in the comments on YouTube if there are, in fact, earlier Venus retrograde in Aries repetitions prior to 1993. There's probably some in his life too. That would be another one to check. All right. Let's see. Another one on May 8th, Russia held a large World War II celebration in Russia with many foreign dignitaries, including the president of China. And um, this was unique because it was one of the largest one of these that they've done in a while. And it was also the 80th anniversary of um, the one that they did in 1945 after the end of World War II. And we had actually mentioned that one because that was like the biggest thing that stood out about 1945, is that marked the end. the defeat of Germany and the end of World War II in Europe during that Venus retrograde in Aries in the first half of 1945. And then one of the things we noted in the episode recorded on January 10th was that Russia held like this major victory parade in, I think it was like May or June of 1945 during the tail end of that Venus retrograde that year. So this was a striking repetition on May 8th to see this in the news and to see what a huge celebration it was as an exact repetition of that exactly 80 years later. All right, other miscellaneous news stories that are just ones I noticed that are kind of Venus retrograde. One of them on May 24th in the Washington Post, there was a headline that said, "Two women are shattering a figure skating taboo by dancing together." So it's two like women as partners doing a figure skating routine, which is interesting and cool. Another one on May 22nd or thereabout, I noticed a story that said that a long lost um, bust of Jim Morrison what that was stolen from his grave had been recovered after being gone for like decades. That somehow they on his like tomb, I think in like France, they had done a bust of his face and head, but somebody stole it like decades ago. And then during this Venus retrograde, somehow they recovered it. So like something from the past came back into the present. Um, there was a few, I got three or four that were sent in by listeners. I'll mention a few of them really quickly. A listener named Charles Major sent one in about a woman named Desiree Turner, who was a young Utah girl who beat the odds of death after a shooting in 2017, but now 8 years later is said to be in hospice care. So that was a really sad example. Also sent in by Charles. He said on April 13th, today at the Golf Masters was the first since 2017 to have the sudden death of a player. So there was a player that passed away on April 13th. It was in this golf tournament, and that had happened. The last time that had happened was 8 years earlier in 2017. Um, a listener named Yvonne O'Connell wrote an email and she said, "I've been listening to the Venus Retrograde podcasts and enjoying them. I literally just read an opinion column in the New York Times by Brett Steffens and Gail Collins. They first met and talked about doing a conversation column in April of 2017 when Venus was retrograde in Aries, but now 8 years later are calling it quits to pursue their own separate books." So there was like a creation of something 8 years ago, and then a completion of something 8 years later when the Venus retrograde recurred, which is kind of similar to like, for example, the Tom Cruise Mission Impossible thing, where he pitches the idea for Mission Impossible in 1993, Venus retrograde, and then he has the release of the final movie potentially in the 2025 retrograde. May 7th, I saw a headline that said, "For the first time in Indian history, two women officers led the official press briefing." So that ties in with a theme of like firsts for women that we saw come up in the original episode and that I've noted a bunch of examples in over the past several months. Lisa Scheim found one that she mentioned in the last forecast episode that we did for no, for June of 2025. You can hear her talk about it in more detail there. But the famous race horse Secretariat, um, has like a fifth house stellium of planets in Aries because we have the birth time for this horse. And what was crazy was that there was this race that happened during this Venus retrograde period in the past couple of months where 19 of the descendants of the horse all ran in the same race. And I think it was like all of the competitors were like all descendants of the same horse. And weirdly, because we know the birth time of the horse, we know that Aries is its fifth house, and Venus went retrograde across that fifth house stellium around that time. So it's that there's a little bit of overlap because there was more than just Venus retrograde going on in Aries this year. There was also the Mercury retrograde in Aries, and there was also the final eclipse in Aries. So that area of everybody's chart was getting extra activated this year, including for some horses, evidently, especially very like prolific ones. On June 3rd, there was a US Navy ship that was named after Harvey Milk, and they renamed it as part of this ongoing thing that's been happening that is not great that I talked about extensively in some of the previous episodes with um, the removal of a lot of things that have to do with like civil rights and recognizing past civil rights people. On June 6th, Michaels announced this week that it had acquired the intellectual property and private label brands previously owned by Joanne Fabrics. So I had noted this as a previous news story that one of the biggest arts and crafts and fabrics companies in the United States went under during this Venus retrograde, earlier in the Venus retrograde. And then it turned out that towards the very tail end of the Venus retrograde, it turned out that one of its biggest competitors basically ended up buying up what remained of the company at this point and will be taking it over. And finally, this last one was just a random Reddit post that I saw recently, but I realized it tied in with this same Venus retrograde cycle, and it might be worth somebody to research this one more. But there was a post on Reddit, and the title was "Today I learned about John Doe number 24, who was a black teenager who was found wandering the streets in 1945." And because he was deaf and seemingly incapable of otherwise communicating, police were unable to identify him and sent him to various mental institutions until his death in 1993. So my ears immediately perked up because 1945 was a Venus retrograde in Aries year, and 1993 was a Venus retrograde in Aries year. So that means he was found during a Venus retrograde in Aries year, and he eventually passed away under a Venus retrograde in Aries year as well. And they ended up giving him later the legal name so he could get benefits later on of John Doe Boyd. But I thought it was striking that his story was coming up this year again when Venus was retrograde in Aries, even though it was just like a social media post on Reddit. Sometime it was a good example of what I call post-mortem astrology, which I kind of maybe need a better name for that because it sounds a little weird, but that's my working title. But the point is that sometimes the memory of somebody can continue to echo and reverberate throughout history um, when certain alignments repeat in the future. And one of the ways that I've found that to happen is through, for example, Venus retrogrades. And so for him, especially because his story was tied in with Venus retrograde in Aries, it's not surprising then to see his story coming up again in the present, all these years later after he passed away when that same recurrence happens. And I forgot. That's actually one other piece I wrote as a note about this, which is that when he was found in 1945, they estimated him because they weren't able to communicate with him very well, but they estimated him to be about 16 years old. And if he was 16 years old, then that would mean that he was born in 1929, which was also a Venus retrograde in Aries year. So there's a Wikipedia page about him. It doesn't go into much detail, but apparently there was a book that was published about him around the year 2000 that has more detail. I haven't been able to read the book yet, but it might be interesting if somebody wanted to research his story more. It could be a good case study about Venus retrogrades, and maybe the Venus retrograde could somehow be used to help piece together some of his story even better, perhaps. All right, so I think that is the last of the stories that I wrote down. It wasn't a lot, it wasn't as extensive as some of the last news ones, but there was enough there that was compelling that I wanted to commit some of these notes to some permanent forum in order to share the last bits of my research on Venus retrograde and this particular cycle and some of like the take-home lessons that I learned from that. So I want to take this last piece of this video, since this will be like one of my last episodes talking about this particular Venus retrograde cycle, I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that I've learned from doing this research over the past 6 months, because this is the first time that I've really sat down and researched ahead of time the history of a specific Venus retrograde cycle as extensively as I did in preparation for this one, because we researched it for a few weeks and then recorded that episode on January 10th, shortly after Venus had just moved into Pisces. And that was the day, January 10th was the day of Venus's greatest elongation from the sun. So this is the first time I had done this extensive of both research about the Venus retrograde ahead of time, which then implicitly contains some predictions about what stories would be important. But then also it's the first time that I've tracked it as closely in terms of doing these like many subsequent episodes to give updates and to sort of track and document things as they were unfolding. So I don't know, I think the audience is probably pretty saturated with Venus retrograde stuff. So this will probably be my last treatment of this. It would almost kind of be nice to go back and summarize, to do something summarizing like all of the research that happened and all of the things that worked out over the course of the past 6 months. But this might be sufficient and it might be time to move on, especially given that world events are starting to move so fast and we're about to go into a much different period with Uranus going into Gemini here very soon at the beginning of July. But let me try to summarize some points that I've learned and some advice that I have for researching these periods in the future now that I've done it myself. All right, so first things first, when a retrograde is coming up, I would recommend researching past repetitions ahead of time, because that ended up being like hugely important and impressive that we did that. We could have done it like a little bit earlier, like in December. It almost would have been more impressive, but we released ours still pretty early on January 10th. And by then we could all already see that some stories were like developing. Like I knew Lady Gaga was coming out with an album, I think. So when I saw this retrograde being important for her chronology, like I knew that was going to be a really important turning point for her, this one coming up. But if we had done it even like a month or two earlier, it would have been more impressive. And I may try to do that in the future when some subsequent Venus retrogrades happen over the next decade. So every time a Venus retrograde is coming up, or really any retrograde for that matter, including like Mars or maybe even Mercury, research the history, like especially like the past century, if you can, is essentially what we did, and establish what happened during some of the previous retrogrades of that planet in the same sign. So when you see ones that have been important in the past, when you start to see ones that are important, check for others. Like if one of the things that we could have done is, I'm thinking about ones like I saw when we did the original episode, the Nintendo one, I saw that the Nintendo was released in 1985, but I didn't otherwise, even though that obviously seemed important and obviously was tied in with the Venus retrograde that year in Aries, I didn't look to research other Venus retrograde and Aries periods in 8-year increments to see if other ones came up with Nintendo. I just like noticed that one in 85 and took that it was important and noted it at the time and then called it a day. But sometimes when you see one that's really important, you can kind of infer that there may be others. So it's a good idea to research other potential repetition time periods. So, research the entire 8-year repeating chronology up till now when you're trying to study something for a current possible repetition. Note also, I would recommend when you do this research for a specific retrograde, like for example, at some point when Venus goes retrograde in Scorpio at some point in the next decade, I don't remember when that is coming up, but probably before too long. Um, when you go back and study it in 8-year increments over the past century, note things that come up that are important during the retrograde period, even if it doesn't seem relevant or doesn't seem related to Venus in any obvious way, or it doesn't seem related to Venus retrograde in any obvious way, because on the one hand, sometimes there can be themes that come up during the Venus retrograde that surprise you that you may not have worked into your thinking as being part of Venus retrograde, even though it is. And in some instances, it can actually expand your thinking by just noting important things that happen. It can make you understand what Venus retrogrades are actually about even better. In other instances, you want to note the major stuff because even if it doesn't seem relevant, just sometimes the fact that it's happening during one Venus retrograde can tie it into that cycle based on the 8-year repetitions. So, one of the ones, for example, um, I noted when I was doing the research for the original episode was when I was doing the Venus retrograde and Aries research, I kept noticing a bunch of like air disasters involving airplanes. And I didn't really know why that was the case. And I kind of dismissed it and I didn't write down and note as many air disasters as I could have in the original episode because I thought it wasn't relevant or I thought that it could just be something that's happening all the time. And so I was just seeing like by looking at one small period of time, I was looking at like air disasters happening then, but that maybe there was a distribution of those that was happening like all the time outside of that. So for a long time when I did the original episode, I didn't note those. But then I think eventually I did start to catch on that it was happening much more frequently than I would expect. And then eventually, when the Venus retrograde actually began, there was this string of like air and airplane disasters that happened during the course of this retrograde that really, I think, caught everybody off guard at how often it was happening. And I do think that ended up partially being tied in with the Venus retrograde, which was really surprising, but it was a good example that if you're seeing a repetition of something coming up over and over again in the history, you need to take note of that and you need to write it down because that repetition may then come up again in the future when the same recurrence happens. So don't rule stuff out, even if it doesn't seem obviously related to like the symbolism of Venus or Venus retrograde off the bat, because there may be other reasons that it relates to the symbolism. Like one of the things that I was thinking that it could have partially related to Venus being in Aries because um, Venus in Aries is the furthest it can get from one of its domiciles, which is Libra. And therefore, that placement in some of the ancient traditions, like in Hellenistic or medieval astrology, would have been called the place of Venus's exile, which carries these notions of like travel and being away from home. So one of the like once this started happening, one of the things I was thinking is that could be part of the reason why this particular retrograde was tied in with air disasters was due to that placement of Venus in the sign of its detriment or the sign of its exile. So that was just a speculation, and there may be other reasons, like it could have been just a repetition of some early things potentially in the history of aviation occurring during this Venus retrograde in Aries. So therefore, that's why there were repetitions of it, and it was simply due to the repetitions. I did notice some stuff like that with space travel, especially. A number of very notable early instances of space travel ended up coinciding with Venus retrograde in Aries. And then this one did as well when there was like this celebrity space flight that happened during this Venus retrograde in Aries that was like not received well, that was with like Katy Perry and some other celebrities. All right, so moving on. When researching a cycle, one of the first things you should do that's really helpful is to memorize all of the past years in which that same repetition has happened. So, having this slide where I had all of the Venus retrograde years over the past century and knowing each of the years when Venus was retrograde in Aries, and once I had worked with that enough and done enough of these episodes, it really became committed to memory. I mean, really after the first episode, and once that is committed to memory, when you're just hearing the news or you're reading the news or in conversation with people or what have you, you'll start to take note when those years come up again in conversation or when reading the news, and you'll immediately recognize that that's a repetition. Whereas prior to this time, like if somebody mentioned 1977 to me or mentioned 1905 or 2017, I wouldn't have recognized that those were all years in which Venus was retrograde in Aries. But just having memorized that simple astronomical fact of the repetition of those years in 8-year increments, suddenly unlocked this whole new world in terms of being able to track some of that stuff, even just passively by, watching the news during the course of this Venus retrograde and hearing news anchors like mention, like, well, um, in we just had like an air crash of one of the things that happened is there was this airplane that crashed that carried some of the US figure skating team. And then the news people were like, the last time that happened was 1961 when there was this famous air crash that wiped out the entire US figure skating team. And, you know, before that year would have passed by without me making the connection. But then when that happened and they mentioned that year, I immediately knew that 1961 was both a Venus retrograde in Aries year as well as a Mars retrograde in Cancer year. So having the years memorized is a game changer. And to whatever extent you can, I would recommend that. I've now memorized them for the Venus retrograde in Aries series, but I don't have them memorized for like the other series yet. For the most part, like I know some of the recent ones, like I know the Venus retrograde in Scorpio was 2002, uh, November of 2002. So by extension, I know that recurred 8 years after that in November of 2010 and so on and so forth. So, but in the future, like during each of these retrogrades, that's going to be one of my first steps is to memorize all of these years tied in with a specific retrograde, because that then gives you an immediate access point for understanding what's about to happen or will happen in the future once that retrograde recurs by knowing the years right off the bat in which it happened in the past. All right, so memorize all the years. Um, One of the things, I learned from Nick is take it back a century, even if it crosses over into a different sign, because sometimes that can still stay connected due to the repetitions, like was the case with Nintendo, for example, where the company was founded under this same 8-year Venus repetition back in 1889, even though technically the Venus retrograde was happening entirely in Taurus at that point. And even though nowadays that same retrograde repetition happens in Aries and Pisces, there's still a connection. So you still want to memorize it going back, a century if you can, even across sign boundaries. And certainly check out Nick's work and his YouTube channel, Nick Dig and Best, for more about some of the studies he's done and the specific system that he's developed for um, tracking and referring to, like categorizing the different Venus retrograde repetitions that happen that's independent of the zodiac, because I think that's a great approach to have at this point, even though I still, for myself, like taking the zodiac into account and still will keep referencing things largely relative to that for my purposes. But I can understand now the value of also being able to look outside of that at the same time and to sort of like free the cycle from the zodiac. Both are relevant. The other thing that's hugely important that came up in this one is that it's really important to note any other recurrences that coincide with the Venus retrograde in the current cycle. So, for example, in this cycle, we had not just Venus retrograde in Aries happening, but we also had Mars retrograde in Cancer and Leo happening virtually at the same time and kind of like overlapping. We also had a Saturn-Neptune conjunction taking place and coming very close around the same time as the Venus retrograde. And that was actually even more relevant during this particular one because the Venus retrograde, once it's stationed in Aries, would retrograde back and cross over the Saturn-Neptune conjunction as both before and after it was stationing in late Pisces. So the Venus retrograde itself was like activating the Saturn-Neptune. You also have to pay attention to, in this one, there was a recurrence of eclipses taking place. So, for example, this one, we had this important eclipse that took place at the end of March in Aries. And so that was another coincidence of something that could be looked back in terms of repetitions because there's these like 19-year repetitions of eclipses, for example. So this is important because when you look at other parallel coinciding repetitions, it can help you to narrow down more specific manifestations and more specific ranges of manifestation, as well as like scenarios that might happen when you know that it's both a Venus retrograde in Aries and it's also a Saturn-Neptune conjunction and it's also a Mars retrograde in Cancer and eclipse in Aries, because then it's like it starts feeding in multiple data points of possible repetitions rather than just one. So the specific thing though that's important about that's important about looking at dual repetitions is that it links together certain years much more strongly, and it will tell you which years are going to be even more important in terms of past Venus retrogrades than you might think. So, for example, I mentioned in 1961, there was that plane crash that occurred with the US figure skating team. And that year was both a Venus retrograde in Aries, but also Mars retrograde in Cancer. And then that recurred this year in 2025, and there was a plane crash that involved a significant number of people from the US figure skating team. Or another one that I mentioned is like, 1953 and the overthrow of the US and British overthrow of the Iranian government, and how that was both a Venus retrograde in Aries year, but also a Saturn Neptune conjunction year at the same time. So both of those help to narrow down and specify more specific years within the past like century of Venus retrogrades by noting what other parallel repetitions are happening at the same time. So overlapping recurrences really seems key here. And that's one of the major things that I learned in doing this research. This also shows up in birth charts as well, interestingly, where you know a particular retrograde is important when a person was born under a dual recurrence of the same repetitions that are happening now. So, for example, in the last episode, I talked to a listener who was born in, I think, 1961, around the time of a Venus retrograde in Aries and a Mars retrograde in Cancer. And then this year, when those two transits and planetary periods essentially recurred or repeated themselves, it was a major important turning point in her life. So you've got to pay attention to that because that will tell you in some individuals like if a person's born under a specific retrograde, or if they're born under two retrogrades, especially, then you know that when those recur in the future, that's going to be a very important turning point in that person's life. So that's one of the take home lessons that I learned when doing this research this time. So that point is actually tied in with other planetary periods, but also this broader, more long-term category called Babylonian goal year periods. And this is something I've been researching a lot over the past year and a half or so, ever since doing the year ahead forecast in what was it? It was the year ahead forecast for 2024. And in trying to find out what would happen with the um, Venus, with the Mars retrograde in Leo, Nick told me that there's a major recurrence every 79 years of Mars going retrograde, almost to the same degree. And I ended up researching this and remembering that this is tied in with this broader category of periods called Babylonian goal year periods, where they had found repetitions for the different planets that were very long term, like that one's 79 years for Mars. So that's really cool. And that one ended up being tied in with actually that one's just crazy because that was the one that I learned about the day before we did that forecast for 2024. And I was looking into it. And when I saw that repetition, I immediately understood the implications for the 2024 election because I realized that Trump was born in 1946, just after Mars was coming off of a retrograde in Leo and Cancer. And so when he turned 79 years old, that would be an exact repetition of Mars coming off of a retrograde in Leo and Cancer. So I both knew um, that Mars retrograde would be getting started back in November at the time of the 2024 US presidential election when Mars moved into Leo right before the presidential election before going retrograde in December, but also that when he turned 79, that would be the exact recurrence of that Mars transit. And he, of course, just turned 79 in the past week. And then he held a military parade that weekend in Washington, D.C. And at the same time, Israel, which was backed by the US, launched the war with Iran. So that was a crazy activation and repetition of something that was built into the birth chart with Mars, which is on his ascendant in his birth chart at the end of Leo, coming to full fruition in terms of that placement, right at the exact 79-year repetition of that Mars placement. So that's a really great example of the Babylonian goal year periods, which are just long-term planetary period repetitions. I'm going to be doing an episode on this at some point here soon with my friend Patrick Watson, because him and I have been researching this extensively over the past year. Um, and one of the things that's interesting about this is that the Mesopotamian astrologers set up projects to study these long-term periods for centuries. And they were going out every single night and they were observing the sky and where the planets and the stars were. They were writing it down, but then they were also writing down political events that were happening at the time. They were writing down the price of different commodities in the markets. They were noting like the height of the river at the time. And they were just tracking this and compiling these records for centuries. And I believe that they were seeing and tracking similar repetitions as what we're seeing here in these repetitions, especially with Venus retrograde, but also with Mars retrograde and other planets, and that's part of the reason why they were doing those long-term research projects, where one of them that's called the astronomical reports, that program of going out and observing the sky every night and writing down what was happening in the sky and on Earth became the longest running scientific program in history that lasted for something like 500 years. And I absolutely, just watching how these planetary periods work, I absolutely know that they would have been noticing similar repetitions happening and would have been documenting them. And that would have been the reason why they would have developed some of the systems that we know as goal year periods, because they would have identified some repetitions as being particularly important and powerful. So I hope to expand on that more, but the 8 year period of Venus was the Babylonian goal year period, and that was the shortest one because for Venus, they just had the 8 year period. But for other planets like Mars, it was 79, and I think Jupiter was 83, and so on and so forth. So Unfortunately, like not all of those periods were passed off to some of the later traditions where I don't see the Babylonian gold year periods showing up in the Hellenistic and medieval traditions. And I think there was something got messed up or some error happened in the transmission because instead they ended up using these other longer term planetary periods that were based on adding up the number of bounds or terms there were in the zodiac, and those periods don't seem as useful as based on an actual astronomical notion as these planetary periods. So part of the work that I'm doing and part of the reason why this is very exciting is I think we're actually recovering something from the ancient Mesopotamian tradition that existed, 2 or 3 thousand years ago that was lost, but that is actually very powerful and very useful in practice. And it's exciting because it shows a much greater level of complexity in the basic technique of transits than was understood up until recently. So a lot of exciting stuff there, and I hope to, that was part of the reason I did all this research on Venus over the past 6 months and all these episodes, because I wanted to do that as one piece of the broader project to study and research and explain and sort of revive the Babylonian gold year periods. And I think that I've completed that in terms of Venus, and also did a ton of work on Mars this year with the Mars retrograde in Cancer. So now applying that to all the planets is part of the next step. Another point that I learned from this is that the range of meanings of Venus is probably broader than Western astrologers realize, that there's a lot more complexity and depth and nuance and different significations that are possible with Venus than we might think. And I think that's really important because one of the things I've been learning about the Mesopotamian tradition is they had a much more nuanced view of Venus than we might have today, where I feel like some of the significations got kind of constrained and boxed into a much more narrow range due to some of the perception of associating Venus with the Greek goddess Aphrodite or the Roman goddess Venus. But the goddess that Venus was associated with in the Mesopotamian tradition had other facets of it that are important that we've kind of lost. But through some of this work in researching the Venus retrograde periods, I think that we can actually recover to eventually develop a much more nuanced understanding of Venus. But starting to think in terms of that and be aware of that as a potential discrepancy, I think is really important going forward. So the goddess for Venus was Ishtar in Akkadian, and if you start researching Ishtar and the related goddess from the Sumerian tradition, you'll get a better idea of sort of what I'm talking about. All right, so my final conclusion here is just that there are these strange repetitions that are happening underlying reality, and it's connecting events both in time as well as in meaning. And I believe that what we're seeing here is the ability of astrology to study and to map fate. And fate is the interweaving of a sequence of events in accordance with a divine plan or purpose. That's how fate was originally defined according to the Stoics in like the Hellenistic philosophical tradition, as this interweaving and connecting of events according to a plan or according to a purpose. So I think one of the take home lessons, ultimately philosophically for me, is that it implies that people and events have some sort of underlying sense of destiny or purpose or meaning, and that events are not random and meaningless, but instead have these overarching senses of purpose and of design. And there's something incredibly fascinating to me about that from a philosophical and spiritual or religious standpoint that I think is there. And even though I haven't emphasized that a lot, because for my purposes, a large part of what I've been trying to do is just research, practically speaking, and empirically the way that these periods work and how these repetitions play out. But one of the take homes for me it's given me I've already had this, but it's deepened my understanding of the concept of fate and the existence of fate in the universe, and how astrology gives us a window into that and an access point for understanding fate. And, that was the subtitle of my book. The title of my book was that I published in 2017 is Hellenistic Astrology, the Study of Fate and Fortune, because I truly believe that Hellenistic astrology and Western astrology was originally designed as a system for studying fate and being able to describe it and track it and to track the unfolding of a person's fate and destiny through the interweaving of events. And in this technique, I think I want to say in the moment now more than any others, you can see that interweaving because of the way that the repetition of the retrogrades can connect events in the past with those in the present as well as the future. And I think the model for that is that we have to understand that we're studying fate and how fate is a interconnection between events in our lives that otherwise on the surface might seem disconnected or might not seem connected, but through the lens of astrology we actually have an access point for understanding that beneath the surface, there are these weird connections that are going on that are connecting everything together in this very mysterious, but also very beautiful way. And to me, ultimately, that's very inspiring. And I have this it's like this awe-inspiring sense of the cosmos that this works as well as it does, and it can do some of the things that we're uncovering that it's actually capable of in terms of astrology and the study of the repetition of events across time in the past, in the present, and the future. And there's so many different implications for that that I'm excited to explore and continue to attempt to articulate even more in different ways, uh, because it's so vast and so intricate and so beautiful. But I hope that people can look at the totality of what I've done in the past 6 months with this specific series of the Venus retrogrades and also a little bit on the Mars retrograde in Cancer, and then start to see and learn from it and be able to appreciate, some of what's been found, but also hopefully to apply that to the future. Because I think I've found a lot of different core principles here that I've tried to articulate along the way as I'm noticing different things and trying to sort of like extrapolate what the implication of that is from a technical standpoint, as well as from a like a conceptual or sometimes like even philosophical standpoint. But I hope people are able to take some lessons from this and apply it usefully in the future to study some of these repetitions in other Venus retrograde cycles or this current Venus retrograde cycle. And of course, one of the cool things is this will set things up for 8 years from now when we know Venus retrograde in Aries will recur again in what, 2033. So it'll be interesting to check in again at that point and see how some of the events and some of the stories in the news, the things happening in our personal lives and other things that have happened in the first half of this year, how somehow we'll see an echo and a repetition of some of those things 8 years from now when Venus again does the same thing in the sky, which is go retrograde in the sign of Aries. So I'll be looking forward to seeing how that goes. I hope this has been interesting and like fruitful. I do want to give a shout out and a thanks to all my patrons who pretty much support this work and this research and make it possible for me to do this type of intense deep dives into subjects like this. And for example, to have done the original episode where we went back and researched Venus retrogrades in history. So thank you to those who support my work and research and make this possible. This has become part of doing this podcast has become part of my life's work where I'm I'm doing a lot of research on a regular basis and then putting it out there for other astrologers to learn and to study from and to emulate and to hopefully make good use of. And I'm sure there will be elements of some of these things that others will be able to, now that this foundation has been established, that you'll be able to take some of this and sort of run with it and discover even new things that I haven't even discovered myself. So I'm very excited about that because I think it's taking astrology further into a new era. And there's a lot of things to be really excited about and really hopeful for. So that's kind of where I'm left at this point, now that I've reached the end of this. All right. Well, I'm trying to think if there's anything else I meant to mention since this is the final episode, but maybe that's good. Thanks a lot for watching and taking part in this research and listening to me go through all of this. If you notice any interesting repetitions or anything you'd like to share, please leave a comment, especially below the YouTube video, because that's usually the best place to leave a comment. Or if you've noticed something in the news in a repetition, or if you've had one personally, please post it there, because that's a good way for everybody to share their research and to sort of learn from it. And yeah, if you want to support this research in the future, consider becoming a patron through my page on Patreon or signing up for my Hellenistic astrology course, where I also teach some of these techniques and do live workshops with people. But otherwise, I think that's it for this episode of the Astrology Podcast. So thanks a lot for watching or listening, and I'll see you again next time. If you're a fan of the podcast and you'd like to find a way to help support my research, then consider becoming a patron through my page on patreon.com. In exchange, you'll get access to subscriber benefits such as early access to new episodes, the ability to attend live recordings, the monthly Electional Astrology Podcast, an exclusive podcast series called the Secret Astrology Podcast that's only available to patrons, or you can even get your name listed in the credits. For more information, go to patreon.com/astrologypodcast. Special thanks to the patrons on my producers tier, including patrons Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Issa Sabah, Jeannie Marie Kaplan, Melissa Delano, Sunny Bazbaz, Kwatsi Alabarahu, Annie Newman, Ginger Sodlier, Berlin West, and Nikki Crawford. People often ask me if I'm available for consultations, but unfortunately I'm not right now because the podcast takes up so much of my time. However, I did create a consultations page on the Astrology Podcast website that has a list of astrologers that I recommend for astrological consultations. You can find that at theastrologypodcast.com/consultations. The astrology software we use here on the podcast is called SolarFire for Windows, which is astrology software for the PC. You can get a 15% discount by using the promo code AP15 at the website alabe.com. For Mac users, I recommend the software AstroGold for Mac OS, which is astrology software for the Mac computer made by the creators of SolarFire for the PC. You can get a 15% discount with the promo code AstroPodcast15 through their website at astrogold.io. If you're really looking to deepen your studies of astrology, then I would recommend signing up for my Hellenistic Astrology course, which is an online course in ancient astrology where I take people from basic concepts up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. There's over 100 hours of video lectures, plus monthly webinars and Q&A sessions, and then at the end of the course you get a certificate of completion saying that you studied with me if you pass the final written test. Find out more information at theastrologyschool.com.